Sure, here's an expanded version of part 1 of your story, written in approximately 1,000 words, without any headings. Dash dash dash. I had barely finished unpacking my last box when the knock came. Not a polite tap tap of a neighbor bringing over cookies or welcoming me to the community. No, this was a sharp, insistent rap that told me someone on the other side felt very entitled to my time. I wiped the sweat from my brow, tossed the empty tape roll onto the kitchen counter, and opened the door, expecting perhaps a lost delivery driver or a kid selling magazines. Instead, I was met by a woman in her late 50s, her short cropped gray hair impeccably styled, clipboard in hand, mouth already drawn into a thin, disapproving line before I'd even said a word. "Are you the new owner?" she asked, as if it was already a problem. "Yes, just moved in yesterday," I replied, offering a cautious smile. Still settling in. She didn't smile back. "I'm Carol. I'm on the board of the Lakeview Homeowners Association. We noticed your property extends to the Marina dock. That's actually part of our community's lake access." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She held up the clipboard like a badge. "The HOA maintains rights to the lakefront for all residents. We've always had access through this property. The previous owners allowed it." I leaned against the doorframe, the gravity of her words sinking in. I had bought this house specifically because of the private dock. It had been a major selling point. I'd triple-checked the survey and the deed. Everything I paid for, including the waterfront and the marina structure itself, was mine. No easements, no shared access, nothing. "I understand the previous owners may have allowed it informally," I said carefully. "But the deed doesn't mention anything about shared lake access. The dock and the strip leading to it are all on my property." Carol's expression didn't change. "We've used it for years." I was beginning to get the feeling that this was not a neighborly introduction. It was a warning. The kind that came wrapped in pleasantries and clipped language, backed by people who wore pastel polo shirts and carried measuring tapes in their SUVs. "With all due respect," I said, "I'm happy to look into any historical agreements, but as far as I know, this is private property. I bought it under that understanding." She exhaled sharply, like I'd just told her she wasn't allowed to bring her own wine into a country club. "I suggest you attend our next HOA board meeting. We'll be discussing how best to restore lake access to all residents." "I'm not part of the HOA, I said plainly. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Well, we'll see what can be done." And just like that, she turned and walked off, her heels clicking sharply against the stone walkway like a gavel being struck. I stood there for a few seconds, processing the interaction, unsure whether to laugh or get my lawyer on the phone. I opted for the latter. Within a week, I had a letter from the HOA in the mail. They were formally requesting an easement be granted through my property to restore community lake access. Restore, they said, as though they were reclaiming something lost in a flood. I was being asked, politely but firmly, to surrender control of a significant piece of my land I paid for in full and without any indication that others had a claim to it. The letter went on to say that community members had grown accustomed to using the dock and it was an expected amenity in the neighborhood. It was less a request than a demand dressed in community spirit. I wasn't naive. I'd moved to this lakefront property because I wanted the peace, the view, and yes, the exclusive use of the dock. I didn't want crowds of strangers passing through my yard with kayaks and fishing gear just because they always had. I didn't pay a premium so I could host the neighborhood every summer. So I did what I thought any reasonable person would do. I declined, politely, and I explained the legal facts. I included a copy of the deed with my response and asked that they respect my boundaries, both literal and figurative. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. The very next day, I noticed cars slowly rolling by my house, pausing just a few seconds too long. People who hadn't introduced themselves yet were suddenly inspecting the edge of my lawn. A group of kids wandered a little too close to the dock, and when I stepped outside, one of them muttered something about the new guy ruining the lake. It was clear the HOA had started spreading word about my supposed betrayal of the community. The pitchforks weren't out yet, but the torches were being lit. Then came the letter from Carol again, this time less friendly, more firm. The HOA was now exploring options to secure public access to the dock, and they hoped I would reconsider before things became unnecessarily complicated. Unnecessarily complicated. That line stuck with me. I reached out to a real estate attorney I'd worked with before and showed him everything, the deed, the survey, the correspondence. He confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no legal ground to stand on. But that didn't mean they wouldn't try to make my life difficult. He warned me, these kinds of disputes can escalate in ugly ways, even when you're in the right. Still, I wasn't about to back down. This wasn't about being difficult, it was about protecting what I had every right to enjoy. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. What I didn't expect was who would end up being my unlikely ally in this mess, the marina owner across the lake. A man who had dealt with the HOA years ago, and who had a very different idea of how these community stewards operated. But that part comes later. For now, I was the newcomer who had dared to say no to the HOA, and they weren't used to hearing that word. They thought they could lean on me until I caved. They were wrong. Sure. Here's part 2 expanded to approximately 1,000 words. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up to find 3 emails from the HOA. They were riddled with formal language, citing obscure rules from the neighborhood's covenant documents, documents I hadn't received, let alone agreed to. Apparently, I was in direct violation of community standards by using the boat dock without approved authorization. I rubbed my temples and chuckled dryly. That dock sat on a portion of the lakefront owned by the property I just bought. The deed was ironclad. Yet here they were, trying to scare me with policy and bureaucracy. I knew they weren't just overstepping, they were testing me. HOAs are like wolves when they smell weakness. They thought I was new, naive, easy to intimidate. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent 20 years running a marina in another state, dealing with every kind of authority imaginable. Environmental commissions, zoning boards, county inspectors, even the Coast Guard once. I'd handled all of them with grace and grit. A paper-pushing HOA didn't scare me. Still, I decided to play it cool. I replied courteously, asking them to point me to the specific clause that allowed the HOA access to private lakefront property. I also asked for a full copy of the HOA's bylaws and any recorded easements or rights of way. They didn't respond for 3 days. On the 4th day, a maintenance truck rolled up unannounced. 2 men in reflective vests started walking down the side of my house toward the lake, carrying spools of rope and a stake hammer. I walked out and asked them what they were doing. One of them said, "We're marking off the HOA's community shoreline. Per the president's orders." I told them to stop immediately. "You're trespassing," I said, trying to keep my voice even. They laughed nervously, probably not used to being challenged. I walked them back to their truck and made it clear that the next time they stepped foot on my land without written permission, I'd be calling the sheriff. They left in silence. Later that evening, I drove over to the county recorder's office. I pulled all the documents related to the HOA's incorporation, including land use maps and any community easements. As I suspected, there was no legal basis for them to claim any part of my lakefront. My deed included the shoreline and 50 feet into the water. I wasn't part of the original development. My house was a private sale, previously owned by an old couple who'd never joined the HOA. No clause in the county records ever tied my property into their jurisdiction. Armed with facts, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in a beige community center a few blocks away. Folding chairs, stale coffee, a projector on a wobbly table, the whole scene reminded me of a poorly organized PTA meeting. I waited until public comments were allowed. When I stood up, a few people nodded in recognition. Word had already spread, I figured. I introduced myself politely and then laid out my case. My deed, the property lines, and the fact that the HOA had zero authority over my lake access or land usage. I brought copies of the county maps and offered them to anyone who wanted to see. The room went quiet, except for the president, a wiry man in a golf shirt, who tried to interrupt. But I held my ground. I'm not here to pick a fight, I said, but if anyone from this board steps onto my land again without permission, I'll treat it as trespassing. And if you continue to harass me with unfounded claims, we'll deal with it in court. I suggest you consult your own legal counsel before escalating this. You could hear a pin drop. One older woman on the board leaned over and whispered something to the president. He didn't say much after that. For a while, it seemed like things calmed down. A few neighbors even came by to introduce themselves, admitting they were unaware of the details and thanking me for standing up for property rights. I appreciated that. I'm not anti-community, far from it. But I believe in boundaries, both legal and personal. Then, about 2 weeks later, I started noticing something strange. My mail was arriving opened. Packages went missing. The trash pickup skipped my house 2 times in a row. Petty stuff, but coordinated. That's when I realized the HOA president wasn't letting it go. I did a little digging and found out he had been lobbying for years to get all lakefront properties designated as community access points. My property was the only thing standing in his way of connecting a long, public shoreline trail he was trying to sell to the board and future homebuyers. So I hit him where it hurt. I contacted the county zoning department and asked about the trail plans. When they said they hadn't approved any such development, I filed an official complaint about unauthorized land use planning. Then I contacted a local journalist who ran a real estate column. I gave her everything: the false claims, the unrecorded easement attempts, the pressure tactics. She ran the story under the headline, "New Resident Blocks HOA's Illegal Lake Grab." The fallout was immediate. The HOA board had an emergency meeting. Several members stepped down, citing lack of transparency. The president tried to deny everything, but with public records and interviews backing me up, he had no ground to stand on. Eventually, he resigned, quietly and bitterly. I never got an apology, but I got something better: silence. No more emails. No more trucks. My trash got picked up on time. Neighbors waved instead of stared. I'd earned my space. Not through hostility, but by standing firm and being unshakably prepared. Sometimes, people mistake calmness for weakness. They assume if you're not loud, you're not ready for a fight. But I've always believed that strength is best shown in restraint, until it's time to act. Let them learn the hard way.